He was the pride of his people, the very first person in the history of Japan to qualify for the Olympic Games. Shizo Kanekuri was a 20-year-old marathoner and one of his generation's finest athletes. The year was 1912, and the Games were being held in Stockholm, Sweden. Olympic teams from the United States chartered entire ocean liners to take their athletes over to Europe so they would have enough room to rest, but also to keep their training up to speed. It was Japan's very first entry into the Olympics. Their teams didn't have a lot of money. Shizo Kanekuri traveled to Stockholm on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It was a long journey. To keep himself in shape, whenever the train would stop at a station, he would quickly hop out of his car, run up and down the platform, and then jump back on before the train took off. When Shizo finally made it to Sweden, he was worn out by the travel. And then he started eating the local Swedish food, things like, rotting fish and all that wonderful stuff, and it upset his stomach. To make matters worse, it was July, and Sweden was experiencing a heat wave. And then the marathon course was over crushed gravel that reflected all the heat back up to the runners. 68 runners began that race in 1912. Only 34 people finished it. After about 16 miles, Shizo got heat exhaustion. He became disoriented, and he veered off the course and wound up in someone's garden, unsure of where he was and exhausted. A local family took him in, fed him raspberry juice and cinnamon rolls, gave him a change of clothes and a bed to sleep in. The next morning, Shizo woke up completely humiliated. He felt like he let down his entire country. Here was Japan's first ever Olympian, and he wasn't even able to finish the race, much less win it, or even place. This is what Shizo wrote in his diary that morning after he woke up. It's the morning after my defeat. My heart is aching with regret for the rest of my life. He left Sweden ashamed and in secret. He didn't tell the race officials where he was. He didn't report to any of the Olympic organizers. He just left. But when Shizo got back to Japan, he focused himself on continuing to run. And he particularly gave his attention to training and coaching people who had traditionally been left out of Japanese sporting events. So he recruited female runners to start training for marathons. He helped coach blind people by giving them a piece of string, and he took the other end and ran ahead of them to help them learn how to pace a marathon. And yet, all this time, Swedish officials had no idea where he was. The Swedish government concluded that he was missing. And folklore around Sweden spread of where is Shizo? Is he living in a cave? Is he haunting little kids in their dreams? No one knew. In 1967, Swedish officials finally learned where Shizo was. And they contacted him, and they invited him to come back to Stockholm to finish that race that he had started in 1912. Well, Shizo crossed the finish line. 54 years, 8 months, 6 days, 5 hours, 32 minutes, in 20.3 seconds after he had started that marathon. Shizo's story reminds me of our reading from 2 Timothy this morning. The Apostle Paul is near the end of his life, and he reflects back on his life of faith, and he frames it as a spiritual race, much like an Olympic game. There is a race course, there's a finish line, there's awards. But the point of Paul's spiritual race was not to win. It was to maintain trust in God as revealed in Jesus, so that he would live in ways that fostered self-giving love. Our lives are in a state of impermanence. They constantly change from day to day, week to week, minute to minute. This includes our physical bodies, they change. It includes our spiritual lives. They change too. Our trust in God changes. Sometimes we're running our spiritual race at an expert pace. We feel connected with God. We are engaged in loving service of those around us. But there are also times when we're exhausted. Maybe we get heat stroke and we veer off the course. We wind up in someone's garden feeling disconnected from God. And the last thing we want to do is love someone else. Throughout all of these twists and turns in our lives, Paul encourages us to keep hold of these patterns of worship. We don't gather here on Sunday mornings just to put on a show. We gather together for worship that transforms us and that changes this world. Worship gives us the opportunity, when we feel connected with God, to give God thanks, to express joy at the blessings that God has given us. And in those times where it feels like God's absent, it gives us a chance to be encouraged by our holy friends, to keep going, to not give up. In worship, we are transformed by the transcendent music that you fine folks give us, that we participate in together. We enter this conversation of the scriptural story that shapes and gives direction to our lives. And we meet God's presence in communion. And as we are transformed, we transform this world through our love, our prayer, our actions, but also our very witness for being here. We model for this city a way of life centered on love and worship. Last week, Carol talked about some of the exciting partnerships and mission opportunities that we're going to be focusing on for next year. Things like the closet and the cupboard and many more. Well, worship and service go together. Worship inspires us to serve, gives us the encouragement to continue, and it gives us a direction on how we serve. And what I'm going to say next sounds a little bit paradoxical, sounds maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but I think there's a deep wisdom tradition behind it, and I've seen the truth of it in my own life. When we serve others, even in the midst of doubts or distress, we find joy, and our faith is strengthened. The Buddha said it like this 2,500 years ago. Focusing too much on our own self-interest brings us pain and anxiety, but extending our love and care to others, even strangers or those who cause us trouble, brings us joy and peace. Jesus taught us something very similar in Matthew chapter 6, when he told his followers to seek first God's realm and the other joys in life would fall into place. One of the ways that we see God's realm together is by supporting the worship that we're engaged in right now, that inspires us to serve and love this world. And I hope you'll join Lori Gray and I as we support this worship through our annual giving season that's going on. When Shizo Kanekuri went back to Japan, he didn't give up on running, even when he was ashamed of himself and deeply discouraged. He kept running, and he looked for people in his life that he could help through doing that. And then when he received a call from Sweden, he returned to that place where he had started that race 54 years ago. And after he crossed that finish line, the Swedish government had set up loudspeakers, and they announced that the Olympic Games of 1912 had finally come to a close. Well, this week, some folks within our community have finished their spiritual races, and they've been embraced by God's presence. People like Priscilla Lind lived a lifetime of faithfulness. And then this morning, we have two people, Holly and Stephen, who've known God for a long time, but they're starting a brand new leg in their race through baptism. And I hope you'll have a chance to meet them, because it's been so encouraging to me to hear their stories and their excitement of what God is doing in their life. Friends, it doesn't matter where you are in the twists and turns of your spiritual races. God comes to you this morning and invites you to keep running. Amen.